There is a flowering plant that fixes 200 pounds of nitrogen into the soil per acre every season without fertilizer, without amendment, without any input at all. It blooms in brilliant purple spikes. Bees love it. It grows in poor soil where almost nothing else will. Ancient farmers planted it for centuries. Modern gardeners grow it for decoration and never realize it is also free fertilizer. Why did nobody tell them? Two things explain why the connection between this flower and free soil nitrogen has become invisible to most modern gardeners. One involves what the plant is actually doing underground while everyone is admiring what is happening above it. In the visible, photogenic world of spikes and color and bee activity that garden photography captures and social media shares, the other involves who profits every time a gardener buys a bag of nitrogen fertilizer and plants lupins in the flower bed next door. Without ever realizing, the two things are solving the same problem, and therefore, why nobody with a financial stake in the interaction has ever been motivated to explain the connection. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly how lupins fix nitrogen at the cellular level, why ancient Mediterranean and North American farmers used them to restore exhausted soil for thousands of years, why a plant that costs $2 of seed and comes back every year has been quietly growing next to $40 bags of fertilizer in garden centers, without anyone explaining what connects them, and what you need to do to start using this connection in your own garden today. The place to start is not with the flower. It is with the soil beneath it, and with what is happening there that no gardening photograph has ever captured. Because roots are invisible, and bacteria are invisible, and the process of nitrogen moving from the atmosphere into the soil through a living biological partnership is invisible to everything except the plant growing in that soil the following season, which is noticeably greener and taller and more productive than the plant growing in the bed next to it. Nitrogen is the most critical nutrient in any garden soil. It drives leafy growth, chlorophyll production, amino acid synthesis, and the cellular division that makes a plant visibly healthy and productive. Without adequate nitrogen, plants yellow from the bottom up, growth stalls, and yields collapse, regardless of how well everything else in the soil is managed. This is why nitrogen is the first number on every fertilizer bag. The N in the NPK formula printed on every product in the garden center fertilizer aisle. And the nutrient, the fertilizer industry, has built its entire marketing infrastructure around solving, but the soil does not run out of nitrogen, because nitrogen is scarce on Earth. 78% of the atmosphere above every garden in the world is nitrogen. The air above a single acre of garden soil contains more nitrogen than any commercial fertilizer application could deliver in several lifetimes of continuous use. The problem is not scarcity. The problem is that atmospheric nitrogen is locked in a molecular form that plant roots cannot access. Nitrogen gas is two nitrogen atoms bonded with a triple bond, one of the strongest chemical bonds in existence. Breaking it requires either the energy of an industrial chemical plant running at hundreds of degrees Celsius and extreme atmospheric pressure. The Haber-Bosch process that underpins the modern fertilizer industry and consumes roughly 2% of global energy production annually. Or a living organism that evolved the biological machinery to do the same thing at ambient temperature in the cool dark of the soil. Those organisms exist. They have been doing this work for hundreds of millions of years, and they do their best work inside the roots of lupins. Lupins belong to the legume family, the same plant family that includes peas, beans, clover, alfalfa, vetch, and virtually every crop that traditional farmers used to restore soil fertility before synthetic nitrogen existed. Every member of this family hosts colonies of rhizobium bacteria in specialized structures called nodules that form on their root systems, triggered by chemical signals exchanged between the plant and the bacteria when the plant is young and its roots are actively seeking contact with the soil community. The bacteria recognize the chemical signal from the legume root and respond by multiplying at the contact site, stimulating the formation of the nodule structure that both houses the bacterial colony and protects the oxygen-sensitive nitrogenase enzyme inside it. These bacteria carry a biological tool called nitrogenase, an enzyme complex that is one of the most energetically sophisticated biological machines that evolution has produced, capable of breaking that triple nitrogen bond at ambient temperature and pressure using energy delivered through a precise electron transfer chain powered by the sugar the legume provides through its roots. The nitrogenase converts atmospheric nitrogen into ammonium, the ionic form that plant roots absorb and build protein, DNA, chlorophyll, and every other nitrogen-containing molecule in plant tissue from. The lupin provides the bacteria with sugar made through photosynthesis, delivered through the root as a constant food supply. The bacteria provides the lupin and every plant growing nearby, with a continuous supply of fixed nitrogen that builds up in the soil as nodules die, are replaced, and their nitrogen-rich tissue decomposes. Neither organism can do this alone. Together, they run a biological nitrogen factory in the soil that has no invoice and no delivery schedule. A well-managed lupin stand fixes between 100 and 200 pounds of nitrogen per acre over a growing season. Some research has documented individual stands exceeding 250 pounds under favorable soil and climate conditions. For context, a bag of synthetic nitrogen fertilizer delivering 100 pounds of nitrogen to a typical garden plot costs somewhere between $20 and $60, and is largely gone by the end of the season, washed out by rain and consumed by plants within weeks of application. The lupin delivers comparable or greater nitrogen, builds it into the soil biology through root nodule decay and plant matter decomposition, and either returns the following year as a perennial or reseeds itself as an annual, continuing the cycle without a purchase of any kind. Stay with me, because the history of what this plant was used for is the part that most gardening guides leave out entirely. And it is the part that makes the modern disconnect between lupins and fertilizer bags so striking once you see it. The history runs for at least 4,000 years and spans multiple continents and entirely unconnected agricultural traditions. Every one of them arrived at the same practical conclusion through direct observation, rather than through any shared knowledge of chemistry or biology. The conclusion was the same, because the biology was the same, and the biology has not changed. Ancient Mediterranean farmers knew about lupins as a soil restorer long before anyone understood nitrogen fixation as a chemical process. The Romans called it lupinum and rotated it with grain crops, specifically to restore fertility to exhausted fields. Columella, the Roman agricultural writer of the 1st century CE, described the practice in detail in his agricultural treatise De Re Rustica, noting that plowing lupin back into the soil improved subsequent grain yields as effectively as applying manure. Pliny the Elder made the same observation in his Natural History, written around 77 CE, noting that a single lupin crop turned into the soil left the ground in better condition than it had been found, and specifically recommended lupin as the ideal restorative crop for fields that had been cropped too heavily for too many consecutive seasons. These were not isolated observations. They represented centuries of accumulated agricultural practice, the kind of knowledge that emerges not from a single field trial, but from generation after generation of farmers watching what happens when certain plants precede others in the rotation. The Greeks used lupins. The Egyptians cultivated them both for the edible seeds, which were soaked to remove bitterness and eaten as a common food across the Mediterranean world, and for the soil-building function. Medieval European farmers inherited the practice and embedded it in crop rotation systems that sustained productivity across land that was continuously cultivated for centuries without synthetic input of any kind. The Andean civilizations of South America independently discovered a closely related phenomenon with their native lupin species, Lupinus mutabilis, which they called tarwi. Tarwi was cultivated in the Andes for thousands of years as both a food crop and a soil restorer, with Andean farmers rotating it through their terrace systems the same way Mediterranean farmers rotated their lupins through flat grain fields. With no contact between the two traditions and the same practical conclusion, the field where this plant grew comes back more productive the following season. The underlying mechanism was not formally identified until the late 19th century, when scientists first observed the rhizobium bacteria and began to understand their role in nitrogen fixation, finally explaining in chemical terms what farmers had been observing in practical terms for over 2,000 years. The discovery confirmed everything the ancient rotation had been doing. It just gave it a name. Here is where this reaches you directly, in the garden you are managing right now. Lupins are widely available at garden centers in most parts of the world. They are sold as ornamental perennials for cutting gardens and flower borders, valued for their tall, colorful spikes that come in purple, pink, white, yellow, and dozens of cultivated varieties bred specifically for flower size and color range rather than nitrogen-fixing capacity. The seed is inexpensive, the plants are straightforward to establish, and they thrive in slightly acidic, well-drained soil conditions that the most common and least productive garden soils tend to naturally provide. This is not a coincidence. Lupins evolved to colonize poor, disturbed ground precisely because the nitrogen-fixing bacteria in their roots give them an advantage in soil where competing plants that depend on soil nitrogen alone cannot establish as quickly. They grow in soil too poor for most flowering plants, and they improve that soil while growing in it. Most gardeners who grow them have no idea that the vegetable bed 3 feet away is nitrogen deficient, for exactly the same reason that the lupin bed is not. The practical application is more straightforward than almost any other soil improvement technique available to a home gardener. Plant lupins in or immediately adjacent to vegetable growing areas in the off-season, or interplant them as a companion crop in permanent growing beds. When lupin growth is cut or mowed before it sets seed, and the material is left on the soil surface or incorporated shallowly, the decomposing plant tissue releases the nitrogen it fixed during the season into the surrounding soil. This is the chipon drop method used in permaculture, food forests, and organic market gardens, and it delivers nitrogen to the following crop in a gradual, sustained release pattern that most synthetic applications cannot match for consistency, because the nitrogen enters the soil system through decomposing organic matter rather than as a soluble salt that the next rain event can carry below the root zone. Annual lupin varieties used as a cover crop can be sown in late summer or early autumn, grown through fall, and terminated in late winter or early spring before the main planting season, functioning exactly as any other cover crop would. Perennial varieties grown as a permanent fixture in a productive garden border or food forest edge fix nitrogen year after year without reseeding, and can be cut back in late summer to release a nitrogen pulse before autumn planting or spring transplanting into the adjacent beds. The spacing matters for effective nitrogen contribution to nearby crops. Lupins fix nitrogen primarily for their own use and for the soil immediately surrounding their root nodules. Plants growing within a few feet of an established lupin stand benefit from the nitrogen released through root turnover and decomposition. For a row of vegetable crops, interplanting lupins at one plant per 2 or 3 meters along the row edge provides meaningful fertility support through the season, without competing significantly for light or water with the main crop. The inoculant question matters for first-time use in any soil that has not previously grown lupins or similar legumes. Rhizobium bacteria must be present in the soil to colonize the lupin's roots and form the active nodules where fixation occurs. In soil with a long history of legume cultivation, peas, beans, clover, in lawn or meadow, the bacteria are typically already present in numbers sufficient to colonize new lupin roots quickly. In soil that has never grown legumes, or soil that has been heavily treated with fungicides or fumigants that suppress bacterial populations, native rhizobium populations may be insufficient to establish effective nodulation. Lupin-specific rhizobium inoculant, available from seed suppliers for a few dollars and sufficient to treat far more seed than any home garden requires, solves this immediately. Coat the seed before planting and plant within a few hours before the bacteria begin to die from light and desiccation. Active nitrogen fixation is directly visible if you pull a plant and examine the nodules on its roots. Active nodules are pink or red on the interior, a color produced by legomaglobin, the same oxygen-managing molecule found in animal red blood cells, which the bacteria use to maintain the precise oxygen environment nitrogenase requires to function. Pink nodules mean nitrogen fixation is occurring. White or brown nodules mean the bacteria are absent or inactive, which typically indicates absent rhizobium. Waterlogged soil preventing bacterial activity, or soil pH significantly outside the range lupins prefer, which runs from mildly acidic to neutral. Here is where the commercial conversation about this plant becomes worth examining honestly. Garden centers sell lupins as ornamentals in the flower section. They sell nitrogen fertilizer in the garden section. The two sections are typically on opposite ends of the store, organized by product category rather than by the function the products perform, with no signage connecting them and no staff member trained to explain that the thing in one aisle addresses the same deficiency as the thing in the other. There is no financial incentive for a garden center to explain to a customer buying nitrogen fertilizer that the plant 3 aisles over would do the same job. More slowly, but more sustainably, and without requiring a repeat purchase next season. There is no financial incentive for a fertilizer manufacturer to include in its marketing any acknowledgement that a flowering, perennial growing bee in many of its customers' front gardens is addressing the same deficiency their product targets. The two products are not in competition from the perspective of anyone selling them, because the customer does not know they are in competition, and keeping the customer unaware of the competition is the most effective way to preserve both transactions indefinitely. The knowledge that lupins fix nitrogen has never been suppressed or classified or removed from circulation. It appears in every organic gardening guide, every cover cropping manual, every permaculture design text, every history of Mediterranean agriculture, and the agricultural literature of every civilization that is farmed in the European or North African climate zones for the past 2,000 years. Columella wrote it down in the 1st century. Pliny wrote it down in the same century. The information has been continuously available and continuously ignored by the mainstream gardening market for as long as that market has existed, because the mainstream gardening market is organized around selling products, and free nitrogen from a flowering perennial is not a product. What has happened is simpler and more complete than suppression. The knowledge became commercially irrelevant the moment a product existed that could be bought instead. And commercially irrelevant knowledge does not get marketed, does not get shelf space, does not get placed next to the thing it would replace, and does not get taught to the generation that grew up buying the replacement product. Your great-grandmother likely knew that certain flowering plants fed the soil. She may not have known about rhizobium or nitrogenase or atmospheric nitrogen. She knew the observation. The bed where the lupins grew last year does not need as much feeding this year. She knew it because her mother told her, and her mother's mother told her. The same observation that Roman farmers passed to their children and their children's children across 2,000 years of continuous agricultural practice. The lupin is still growing in gardens in exactly the same way it grew in Roman grain fields 2,000 years ago. The rhizobium bacteria in its roots are still doing what they have been doing for hundreds of millions of years before there were farmers to notice it. The nitrogen they fix is still moving from atmosphere to nodule to soil to plant tissue in the same chemical pathway it has always followed. The flower is still purple. The bees still find it every spring, and the soil beneath it is still better, measurably and reproducibly better, than the soil beside it. The vegetable bed next to it still needs a $40 bag of nitrogen every spring. Those two facts have always belonged in the same conversation. They belonged in the same conversation when Columella wrote about it in the 1st century. They belong in the same conversation now. The garden center has just never introduced them. If you found this genuinely useful, watch the next video and do not forget to subscribe. See you in the next one.